now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And welcome everybody to the 5th meeting of this semester's working group. We work on orality, and specifically today we're going to hear about comparative methods. And now we can start with our first speaker, Tyler Creer. Today he's going to introduce us to the Heike Monogatari, which is a Japanese text, and show how we can use it to learn more about Homer and early Greek culture. Tyler, you're welcome to take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for showing up today. I hope that I have some interesting things to talk about, and I really hope to gain some insights from all of you. So as Madalena said, I hope that you won't hold it against me for assuming a certain degree of knowledge with the Homeric poems and kind of the beginning of oral formulaic theory and so forth as it pertains to those poems. I don't assume on your part any prior knowledge about the Heike Monogatari. So that's why I provided the bylock article for any interested people to read up on the textual history of the Heike Monogatari to a little extent. It's a good primer text for that sort of thing, especially if you don't read Japanese. So I'll just give you a little bit more background about the Heike before I jump into my discussion of its textual history. So the Heike, as you might have picked up, is a Japanese war tale from the 13th century. I'll talk in more detail about when the Heike probably first came to be and how it developed over time. But the subject matter of the tale is what first drew my interest to it. It's about a seminal civil war, essentially, between two dominant warrior clans in the 12th century CE, the Genji, or the Minamoto clan, and the Taira, or the Heike clan. So the tale itself is called in Japanese literally the tale of the Heike, or the Taira clan. So the story is basically about how the two samurai clans fight for control of the country. Ultimately, it ends in the defeat of the Taira, or the Heike. Their clan is effectively annihilated, and the Minamoto then become the rulers of the country, establish the shogunate, and basically that's the method of Japanese government for the next 600 plus years. The tale itself, though, is fascinating in its creation and development over time. It was popularized initially by blind traveling singers called biwa hoshi. It also has a lot of other similarities to the Homeric poems and other works of oral literature. It features repetitive language, type scenes, formulas, that sort of thing. There are some interesting differences. For one, it combines metrical poetic text with basically just prose passages and things like that. I'll give a little bit more insight into why that is a little bit later in my talk. But it proves as a fascinating comparandum for the Iliad and the Homeric tradition, mostly because it is similar but extremely different, especially in its context and its geographical provenance. So I found that it's a very useful comparandum because of that isolation. It has so many similarities that you can not assume any sort of cross-contamination or anything like that. Another big advantage, however, is its significantly greater body of source material. We can just trace much more of the Heike's textual history and everything like that than we can with the Homeric poems. So that's basically what we're dealing with today. And perhaps now we'll talk more about how this pertains to the Homeric poems, basically what we can do with all of this. So no other aspect of the Homeric question seems to have intrigued or baffled scholars more than its textual history. There are just several major questions that have been asked of the Iliad and Odyssey for millennia, and the entry of oral formulaic theory into the conversation has created several more, perhaps even more anxiety-inducing questions. They've been of some interest to me for quite a while now, but progress has proved difficult to come by given the extremely limited amount of evidence that we have from antiquity that survives to us. Unlike several other recently studied oral traditions, we have no recordings of ancient epic performances, nor even many literary descriptions of them, upon which we can base our reconstructions of how Greek bards might have practiced their craft. Given the situation, comparative evidence remains a vital source to the study of how the Homeric poems developed as both performed and written texts. So my talk today will explore the comparative textual history of the Iliad and the Heike Monogatari. I'll discuss first how the Heike tradition is considerably better sourced and understood than that of the Iliad, and that it features a significantly more robust body of surviving manuscripts, which allows us to trace with some confidence the evolution of the tale from its inception in the decades following the 12th century Genpei War up through the end of the Edo period in the 19th century CE. I think of particular interest to this reading group will be the interplay between the oral and written traditions of the Heike, which appear to have existed contemporaneously for several centuries as the tale continued to be both read and performed throughout Japan. This history can in turn provide new perspectives on the similar, but much less well understood interaction between the oral and written traditions of the Iliad, which have often been seen as incompatible with, if not entirely inimical to one another. So although the precise origin of the Heike remains uncertain, its evolution over time from a grouping of loosely related oral tales to a complex, thematically unified work is significantly better attested than that of the Iliad. The first mention of the Heike in a datable historical source comes from a 14th century CE journal, which recounts that a court-educated priest named Yukinaga wrote the Heike in the early 13th century and taught it to a blind musician, whose unique singing style became the standard method of delivery in Heike performance thereafter. Scholars earlier in the 20th century were generally persuaded that Yukinaga was responsible for the first written version of the Heike, but few now believe that that his tale was also the source of the Heike's oral performance tradition. This is primarily because of an abundance of oral elements like formulaic and musical repetition that appear in many of the Heike's variant manuscripts, suggesting that the written tale originated as a transcription of an earlier oral version or as a compilation of many episodes that were at one point shorter individual stories, and that these episodes were performed throughout the 12th century by professional singers. Yukinaga thus might have produced the first written Heike, but he did so by frequent appeal to the existing oral tradition that had been accumulating since even before the outbreak of the Genpei War. Unfortunately, relatively little information survives from before the 13th century, a difficulty very familiar to scholars of Greek poetry. What we do know, however, is that biwa hoshi, or lute priests in Japanese, were Buddhist priests who chanted and sang poetry and tales of various sorts to the accompaniment of the 4- or 5-stringed biwa lute, which we see pictured right here. They're first attested near the end of the 10th century. And from that point on, biwa hoshi make fairly regular appearances in other aristocratic diaries, court documents, and other things like that. We're not entirely certain of how biwa hoshi first came to be associated with performance of the Heike and other monogatari. It does seem that by the 11th century, biwa hoshi had effectively divided themselves into two distinct groups: singers of folk tales and religious fables who were trained and sponsored by Buddhist temples, and others, particularly active in the southernmost regions of Japan and the rough frontier lands of the Northeast, who would accompany armies into battle and sing tales of great warriors and their exploits. While these two groups would undoubtedly have composed songs for very different audiences, the intersection between religious, courtly, and warrior tales in the later standard text of the Heike suggests the importance of both in the development of the tale's oral tradition. It also grants us insight into the possible origins of the various manuscript traditions, which likely sprang from different schools of singers and eventually came to be woven together in the standard version of the tale, the Kakuichi Bon, or Kakuichi book, named after its creator, the famous Biwahoshi Akashi Kakuichi. Multiple accounts from the medieval period tell of the historical Kakuichi, whose distinctive version of the Heike is attested as early as the 1330s in diary entries from the capital of Kyoto. Kakuichi's popularity seems only to have increased in subsequent decades, and he's also credited with reorganizing the musical performers of the Blind Singers Guild, which was a guild that taught not just singing and musical playing skills and such, but also other professional skills to the blind. Kakuichi's career culminated, however, in his completion of the Kakuichi poem by 1371. And a colophon attached at the manuscript's end bears quoting in full. So it says, basically in 1371, Joichi Kengyo finished taking down from my dictation my complete secret text of the 12 books of Heike Monogatari, with the addition of Kanjo no Maki. Kanjo no Maki means basically the initiates book. Talk about more in a little bit. Unworthy as I am now over 70 years old and cannot expect to live much longer. After my death, a disciple of mine might forget this phrase or that and provoke a dispute on the subject. I have therefore had this reference text written down in order to forestall any disagreement. Under no circumstances may it be given or even shown to anyone outside my line. Let no one but my direct disciples copy it, not even my associate teachers and their disciples. May whoever violates these instructions suffer divine chastisement. This colophon, which most Heike scholars accept as genuine, reveals several important details about the state of Heike performance in the latter half of the 14th century. First, it says explicitly that the full 12 books of the text, plus the Initiates book, were dictated to a cited, literate member of the Singers Guild. This speaks further to the inextricable link between oral and written in Heike performance, even among the members of a guild of nominally blind performers. The scribe's literacy is made even more interesting by the statement that Kakuichi's manuscript should serve as a guide to future disciples in order to ensure that they use the exact wording of his version of the tale. This is typically interpreted as signifying that recitation by memorization was the primary method of Heike performance by this point in time, whereas earlier centuries had seen the tale performed in a semi-spontaneous fashion similar to composition and performance. Finally, Kakuichi's insistence that his version of the text only be shown or copied by his direct disciples hints at the existence of other schools of Heike performance that likely use different versions of the tale. Other sources show this to be a fact. For a rival Yasaka school existed in Kyoto at the same time as Kakuichi's Ichikata school, and its members were reported to have used the Yashiro Bon Heike, a variant of the tale earlier than Kakuichi's, as the basis of their performances. Thankfully, we need not speculate too much about the influence of the earlier Heike variants like the Yashiro Bon on Kakuichi's text. Another formidable advantage provided to us by medieval Japan's comparatively robust source base is the capacity to trace the lineage of the Heike or of Heike manuscripts from their culmination in the Kakuichi Bon back to when they first began being written down in the 13th and early 14th centuries. The interaction between the oral and written traditions of the Heike is a central issue of its textual history from its beginning. And this oral-written dichotomy is a defining characteristic of the various Heike manuscripts that have survived. Indeed, one can generally place each of the more than 100 different known manuscripts into one of two categories. The first, yomihon, or reading book texts, were often written in an analytic style that narrated the events of the later 12th century, year by year. And these frequently included letters, court documents, and other primary sources, and read more like a history text. These elements made yomihon text better suited for silent reading than for performance with musical accompaniment, a fact further attested by their having been written in kanbun, a form of classical Chinese that only a highly educated minority in Japan could read or write, suggesting that yomihon versions of the Heike likely would not have seen wide circulation outside of elite or religious circles. Katari Bon scrolls, on the other hand, or narration book texts, or copies of oral versions of the tale written down for memorization and performance by recitation set to music. These were typically written in Japanese kana, simplified Chinese characters that represent the syllables of the Japanese language, and which allowed them to be read by a wider audience and thus were much more suitable for use in memorization. There are differences in how Yomihon and Katari Bon manuscripts are subdivided. Similar to the manner in which later manuscripts of the Iliad were divided into books that often correspond to the individual scrolls upon which they were written. The largest unit of division for Heike manuscripts were maki, which we can translate as scrolls, rolls, volumes, books, if you wish, something like that. These were in turn divided into smaller episodes. The different manuscripts of the Heike tradition show a wide variety in the number of books and episodes they contain. The Kakuichi Bon, as mentioned above, is divided into 12 standard books, with the guild-specific Initiates book, which was appended with the 1371 colophon. While there doesn't appear to be much of a fixation in the Heike tradition with a standard number of books, like the 24 of the Iliad and Odyssey, generally Yomihon texts tend to be longer, have more books, while Katari Bon manuscripts are shorter with fewer divisions. So the oldest known Heike variant is the Engyo Bon, a Yomihon text that is dated by its colophon to 1309. It's written in Kanbun, and the text comprises 6 large books divided into chapters. Its content varies significantly from that of the Kakuichi Bon, particularly because of its many tangents about minor warriors who are never mentioned at all in the Kakuichi text. The Engyo has received probably the most attention from scholars in the last few decades, not only because of all of these variations, but also because of its much less polished prose, which contains frequent inconsistencies and occasional moments of just total incoherence. Because of this, it's viewed somewhat teleologically by many scholars as something of a rough draft for a later, more refined Heike tradition. And this, we think, shows how the tale's text changed over time from annals of court history and warriors' deeds to tales of religiously tinged tragedy, political intrigue, heroic combat, and all the cool things that audiences of the 15th and 16th centuries came to expect. The Yashiro Bon is thought to be the next oldest Heike variant and is the senior-most Katari Bon text. It was probably first written down in the early 14th century. Unlike most or several of the other manuscripts that we'll talk about today, the Yashiro Bon's manuscript gives no indication of its date, but our relatively firm confidence in its seniority rests upon several compelling factors. First, the text is a combination of different scripts featuring both Chinese and simplified Japanese characters, but it has many long strings of words that are written in Sinitic, not Japanese word order. The Yashiro is also divided into 12 books with no discernible divisions between the episodes. But each book features a table of contents which lists each episode. Some have seen this as an early effort at creating a text with episodic divisions for memorization and recitation, which later becomes a standard feature of Katari Bon texts. Next, although the Yashiro Bon does have some formulaic phrases that appear unchanged in later iterations of the Katari Bon line, several of them here are considerably wordier than their descendants, and they appear to have been elaborated on more in a style more textual and written than oral. All these elements combine to form an image of the Yashiro Bon as a comparatively primitive text, whereas later Katari Bon texts are written in more uniform scripts and feature clear-cut episodic divisions with titles. The Yashiro seems to show only early suggestions of these improvements, which seem tailored for easing the difficulty of memorizing and performing the Heike. These factors, combined with the oddities of the Yashiro's formulaic phrases, make it likely that the text was created through a synthesis of smaller oral tales, which appear in the Yashirobon as episodes, and the analytic style of the Yomihon tradition in order to produce something closer to a proper tale of the Heike, rather than a handful of oral episodes or a dry-written chronicle of the Genpei War. Another Yomihon text of relatively early date is the cumbersomely named Shibu Kasenjo Daisanban Tojo, the campaign number 3 of the 4-part battle record. This is thought at one point to have been the earliest Heike text, up until the 1970s, actually. For a long time, it was the most likely candidate to have been written down by Yukinaga in the early 13th century. More recent studies, though, have found that the Shibu, whose oldest manuscript was copied in the 1440s, was probably compiled around in the 1320s. Although these are much later than previously proposed dates, the Shibu's emergence in the mid-4th century still places it among a veritable explosion of Heike variants that were written down around that time. Moreover, the Shibu is unique among other Heike manuscripts because it was grouped with 3 other war tales. It is the 3rd war tale. There are 3 others in this group, so there's 4. The Hogen Monogatari, the Heiji Monogatari, and Jokyuki. The first 2 chronologically come before the Heike and kind of act as prequels to the Heike Monogatari. That these tales were all grouped together in the same large collection probably shows that formerly oral war tales were being written down in relatively significant numbers in the 14th century. And it speaks to their growing popularity and to a demand for written copies, either for sighted musicians to read and memorize, or for just interested lay people. Finally, like the Engyobon and other Yomihon texts, the Shibubon is also far wordier and less poetic than Kataribon Heike variants, meaning that its 12 large books show little of the influence from literary and oral versions of the tale seen in some of the later reading texts. The next Heike variant chronologically is the Kamakura-bon, a Kataribon text probably created by biwa playing priests from a Buddhist monastic center in the early years of the 14th century. The temple complex seems to have been a vibrant nexus of secular and religious music, and the Kamakura-bon shows notable signs of its different influences, particularly through its emphasis on battle scenes, most of which are the most formulaic scenes in the Heike, and the incorporation of principles from the Pure Land Buddhist sect. Kakuichi himself is believed to have been trained as a priest and singer at this monastery because the Kakuichi-bon appears to incorporate the battle scenes, formulas, and Pure Land ideals seen so prominently in the Kamakura-bon, with elements from other texts that place less emphasis on battle narratives. One of these influential texts is the Chikuhakuen-bon, which is dated to sometime before the 1340s. This was likely a revision of the Yashirobon carried out by Kakuichi's biwa hoshi master and several other singers in Kyoto. This variant is generally seen as an effort at pruning away some of the Yomihon elements found in the Yashirobon. It's written in kanji and kana, Chinese characters and kana, which is the standard format for Japanese texts today, and basically starting around the 15th, 16th century onward. Its formulas are also tighter and less wordy, and it's neatly divided into 12 books. Each book also has individual named episodes. All these elements make for a much more organized, reader-friendly manuscript that's considerably better for use as a recitation text. So the Kamakura and Chikuhakuen texts might thus be seen as direct predecessors of the Kakuichi-bon, which seems to incorporate elements of both of these variants. So in the years following its creation, the Kakuichi-bon's dominance seems to have rapidly diminished the popularity of other variants. The Kamakura text was only recently rediscovered in the last century. The Yashiro-bon seems to have disappeared only somewhat more gradually. Despite the popularity of the Kakuichi-bon, however, The Heike tradition did not simply remain frozen in time from the late 14th century onward. Other textual variants appear to have been produced around the same time or even after Kakuichi's text had attained relative fixity. More surprising still, two of those variants, the Nagatobon and the Genpei Josuiki, were Yomihon texts that that have many surviving copies from the Edo period, which likely indicates a preference for recitation texts in this later period. So, although the influence of the Kakuichi text is only attested indirectly in these Yomihon, later Yomihon texts, there are several Katari-bon descendants of the Kakuichi text itself. The first wave of Kakuichi-inspired Heike texts is grouped together under the name Rufubon, or popular editions. These were effectively simplified copies of the Kakuichi Heike, with a few minor variations. Generally, they subtract some of the less popular or cumbersome episodes. Really, it's kind of a highlight reel of the Kakuichi Heike. Some other descendants of the Kakuichi Bon not included in the broad family of the Rufubon were the Heike Ginpu of 1737 and Heike Mabushi of 1776, which introduced musical notations to the Kakuichi text and rearranged its episodes in a sequence in which apprentices were supposed to learn and memorize them. Since musical notation created a fixed musical form in addition to an already fixed written text, these variants are widely seen as marking the effective end of oral performance's influence on the development of the Heike tradition. So what we see across this lineage then are several diverse strands being woven together to form the version of the Heike made familiar by the Kakuichi Bon. The episodic oral nature of the tale, which lends itself well to the stylistic constraints of analytic history, is preserved throughout the Heike's evolution, and its major parts form the narrative that remains consistent from the Engyobon to its Rufubon descendants. Alongside this historiographical spine, however, run three other primary strands, the combination of which distinguishes the Kakuichi text from its predecessors. A learned court influence strand, for example, seems most dominant in the Heike's earlier versions, while a Buddhist strand and a battle strand, which included formulaic arming and archery scenes, are also clearly identifiable in most later versions of the Heike. The Heike tradition thus displays a fascinating interplay between oral and written elements for the first several centuries of its history. Although the medieval Japanese elite seem to have emphasized writing and written text much more than the ancient Greeks, the written-oral interaction still can serve as a valuable comparative tool that might grant us more insight into the textual history of the Iliad. So aside from the established comparanda of the Serbo-Croatian poetic tradition, modern and medieval examples of Heike performance are also of some utility in reconstructing the performance conditions of ancient Greece. In both medieval and modern Heike performances, for example, Biwa Hoshi rarely sang or sing more than a few episodes, with each episode taking about 30 to 40 minutes to perform in full. The Homeric poems also appear to consist of linked episodes, and we might thus deduce that this episode-like form of composition, similar to that seen in the Heike tradition, indicates that the performances of Greek bards also would have consisted of only a few hours of poetry. Based on the similar episode-based genesis of the Heike and its later written oral manuscript tradition, the origins of the Iliad may in fact resemble something like the models put forward by some analyst scholars of the 19th century, namely that the tale is an accretion of episodes drawn from the Greek oral tradition and assembled around a core narrative, which was itself formed from several interrelated episodes. The Iliad, like the Heike, probably did not take shape as a complete tale until its transfer to writing, which many suppose occurred in the 8th century BCE. And in this form, it was also likely the work of a single poet who imposed structure and some stylistic unity on its narrative. However, I see no reason to assume that the Iliad was composed in a near complete fixed form at this early date. As the detailed history of Heike variants shows, especially among the Katati-born texts, it's entirely possible for a written epic to maintain its stylistic integrity throughout several iterations created by oral performers over multiple centuries, which means a core narrative of the Iliad could have been written down for the first time in the mid-8th century and then added to over time by those trained in oral formulaic composition, just as the Kakuichi-bon was produced by blind and sighted singers in a similar accretive process. While the Homeric tradition unfortunately did not produce tables of contents and clear divisions between episodes, examples of the episodic substructure of the Iliad are easily discerned at many points in the poem, simply by looking for places where distinct scenes end and new ones begin. Book 2 in particular is an excellent example of two stylistically very different episodes, tied together in the same book. The first half depicts Agamemnon's near disastrous assembly of the Achaean host, and the second, the catalog of ships and the naming of the Trojan host. Book 10, also known as the Doloneia, likewise stands out in an example of episodic construction, since its depiction of a nighttime raid on a Thracian encampment is referred to nowhere else in the poem and seems entirely self-contained. Moreover, Book 10's 576 lines are not much longer than either of the two halves of Book 2, and also matches the length of longer Heike episodes relatively well, for what that's worth. Beyond these examples, the majority of the Iliad's 24 books similarly feature 1 or 2 episodes each. Moreover, these episodes integrate fairly seamlessly with those around them, and could easily have been added to the poem at any time without disrupting too much its core narrative. So these are some of the key differences between there are some key differences between the episodes of the Iliad and those in the Heike that might illuminate further our understanding of the Iliad's development in this way. By the rough measure I just gave, there are approximately 50 episodes in the Iliad, fewer than the 182 found in the Heike. But this isn't too surprising given the Heike's greater length and the much more variable size of its episodes, some of which are no more than a few dozen lines. The Heike's episodes also appear much more loosely joined together, whereas the Iliad's transition much more seamlessly. The Heike is much more explicitly episodic and made specifically as a text for memorization by bards in its later iterations. These features, particularly when compared with the more sophisticated tradition of the Heike, suggest that the core narrative of the Iliad and its associated episodes weren't as carefully adapted to writing as those of the Heike, and might be closer to those of their original forms than with only slight modifications or additions. So this model of an accretive episodic process that might have formed the Iliad also has bearing on oral formulaic theory. For several scholars have argued that the writing down of the Homeric poems soon after composition led to their textual fixity and the death of oral formulaic composition among the bards who performed the epics. While it's certainly true that oral formulaic composition eventually gave way to memorization and recitation of fixed texts, oralists have perhaps overestimated the speed at which this process occurred. As the Heike tradition suggests, the appearance of written text need not immediately destroy an oral tradition. Indeed, written text can influence oral tales and in turn be altered by oral tradition for several centuries. The long survival of oral and written traditions in the Japanese world could occur in a society with significantly greater emphasis on literacy and writing than ancient Greece, should suggest to us all the more that the appearance in writing of the Homeric poems in the 8th century BC does not preclude the continuation of oral formulaic composition for several centuries thereafter. Furthermore, episodes of the Iliad, which typically feature neat divisions into different scenes, align well with the notion of type scenes or themes that guided performers in their crafting of episodes in performance itself. Given our knowledge of the Heike's manuscript tradition, these points may suggest that we can have greater confidence in the oral basis, even of the written Iliad. So the Dolaneia and the two episodes in book 2 of the Iliad are but two examples of how poets practiced an oral formulaic composition might have influenced an unfixed written Iliad. And these are but a few samples of the fascinating insights that we can gain from comparison between the Iliad and the Heike. The complex interaction over time between oral and written aspects of the Heike tradition suggests several intriguing possibilities for several similar oral-written relationships with the Iliad from what we've discussed today. As I just outlined, it's possible that the Iliad was originally made up of several interrelated episodes, only a handful of which could have been sung in the course of a normal performance, and that there are more of these episodes that were added over time to those that made up a core narrative of the poem, basically several Achilles-centric episodes that basically tell the central story of the Iliad itself. But this could also mean that the Iliad was not in its final form when it was written down in the 8th century BCE, and that guilds of bards like perhaps the Homeridae performed a role similar to that of the Wahoshi in medieval Japan. For if a group of poets trained in oral formulaic technique, formulaic technique of composition, had maintained written copies of their tales, it's entirely plausible that they could have added more episodes to those already there, like we see in the Japanese tradition, thus expanding the story and possibly leading to the creation of yet other epics that would come to make up the Trojan cycle. Finally, the involvement of the Homeridae or other singers' guilds and the Iliad with the Pan-Athenaic festival in the late 6th century BCE could also suggest that this process of episode aggregation reached its culmination around that time. And the resulting collaboration between the poets' guilds and Athenian elites led to Athens serving as a sort of hub from which written copies of a relatively fixed Iliad were disseminated throughout the Greek world. So another avenue of comparison that I'm currently exploring right now is the relationship between performers of Greek and Japanese epic and the supernatural. The Heike was intimately tied to the vengeful ghosts of the Taira clan, who chose to annihilate themselves by plunging into the depths of the sea after their defeat in the Genpei War's final battle. And it was widely believed in pre-modern Japan.
Hi, sorry, could you wrap up in 2 minutes because we're a bit of a...
Yeah, I've got like 3 sentences left.
Okay.
Yeah, it was widely believed in pre-modern Japan that Heike performance could keep these fell shades pacified. The similarity between certain formulas and descriptions of heroic deaths in the Homeric poems and what we see in the Heike might suggest a similar function for the Iliad in antiquity. And so I look very much forward to hearing what Connie has to say, not just about the interaction between oral and written texts, but also rhapsodic performance and the supernatural in the Brazilian tradition in her talk right now. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much for a very detailed talk. So very quickly, Connie Bloomfield, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is our next speaker. She is currently working at King's College after receiving a degree in modern languages and comparative literatures from Cambridge. She also works with poems from both the UK and Southern America. And in fact, tonight he's going to talk to us, this afternoon, depends where you are. She's going to introduce us to poetries from Northeast Brazil and their interaction with orality and writing. Connie, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you, Tyler. That was brilliant, and for segging so naturally into my topics. Tyler and I spoke before about our mutual discussion. So I'm really looking forward to the questions section and get to discuss it in more depth. And thank you so much for Early Text Cultures, because it really is an invaluable experience being able to put these different researches into conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a little PowerPoint, which hopefully is going to work. Okay. So hopefully that should be working. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about some very similar poetic forms, but in a very different time and place. So I'm going to be talking about modern Northeast Brazil and the vast world of Northeast Brazilian popular poetries. By modern, I mean sort of roughly in the last century. So I'm going to start by introducing the region briefly and giving a little history as to how these poetries developed. So the entire coloured area is Brazil. When I say Northeast Brazil, I'm talking about the bit in blue. It is a huge area. I mean, we're talking maybe the majority of Europe could fit in it. So it is obviously very diverse, but one of the unifying cultural features are these popular poetic forms. In terms of the country at large, the northeast of Brazil is one of the most economically deprived areas. It's an area with much less access to formal education. It's also one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse. It's a very harsh landscape. So along the coast, it's much more pleasant. You have the best beaches of Brazil are in northeast Brazil. So post-pandemic, maybe don't visit right now, but if you do want to visit, head to those beaches. But as soon as you start heading inland, the water stops and it becomes a very difficult place to live. So these are just some images to show a bit of the aesthetic of the region. It's mainly, it's very difficult to grow anything. So it's mainly cattle driving, cowboys, and you can see them there. They wear this amazing leather armor because the forests have these massive thick thorns. And there's another paper to be given about the Homeric cycle of the cowboys of northeast Brazil, because they are very much framed as Homeric heroes in the popular poetry. But on the left, you have a popular woodcut artwork depiction of two poets meeting to compete. So these poetries are sort of direct descendants, so to speak, of the Iberian troubadour and court poetries, which were imported during colonization from the Iberian Peninsula. So the theory goes, when they arrived in northeast Brazil, they became very isolated in this sort of semi-arid backlands. So the coast was where the money was. It's where there was enough water to have sugar plantations, which were worked by slave labor. And the inland communities became very isolated, and the poetic forms thus sort of became preserved far longer than they were in Europe. So we've got a sort of time capsule which has enabled the preservation of these earlier forms. They obviously also mixed with indigenous and West African oralities, which were brought during the transatlantic slave trade. So it's quite a unique case study for the meeting of all these different oral and early textual traditions in this sort of time capsule situation, and to see what happens. So I've got a few videos to show what these poetries look like. My first video, now I apologize, they're not the best quality. I've taken them from quite an early documentary, but which captures some really beautiful footage. So the first one is a solo poet who is improvising to a crowd in a marketplace. So the volume is probably not very loud, but it's just to get an idea. The second video is two young boys who are having more of a sort of friendly back and forth, again, improvised. So here they are. Really incredible. And then this next video is a little bit closer to, this is pretty much the form that I'm going to be presenting today, which is more ritualized. It is highly competitive, so they always sing in pairs. It's quite unusual here that we have a woman singing. This is a very male patrilineal profession. It's called cantoria, sung by cantadores. And again, it is improvised. And you sing to demonstrate your poetic prowess and your erudition. It's a profession passed down from father to son. And basically what you do is you claim a poetic territory, could be a marketplace. If you're particularly powerful, it could be a whole town. And you defend your poetic territory against any intruding poets. So these poetic duels are kind of poetic turf wars. But here's an example that's obviously just been filmed for the sake of the documentary. Okay, I should mention with these examples, formulaic composition is frowned upon, which is maybe an interesting spanner in the works. So yes, although there are certain themes that come up repeatedly, if you're seen to be drawing on pre-existing formula or pre-composed verses, you're going to lose, like the audience is not going to be happy with you. So it's really got to be improvised. So the final video is at the end of the 19th century, when the printing press became available to these popular poets, they started to print their works into chapbooks. I've got a couple with me here. You can kind of see what they look like. They're just printed on cheap sugar paper. You can buy them for sort of 50p in the market. But they're very much written to be performed, because the majority of the audience would have been illiterate to an extent, in very rural parts still will be. So they're very much to be performed again. And here is a man performing the romance of the mysterious peacock to a large crowd.
O Conde não conseguiu, outro homem educá-la. Só ele como pai dela teve o poder de ensiná-la, que será muito criado, que dela ouvir a fala.
Okay, so ignore that text for a moment. I had to move to stop the video. So an important thing about these poets is that they are traveling poets. They travel the Northeast. Before TV and radio, these traveling poets would probably be the only contact with the outside world that these isolated communities would receive. And they very much frame themselves as rhapsodes. So they will refer to themselves as rhapsodes or troubadours. They put themselves within the Homeric tradition, and they claim Homer as one of their poetic ancestors. So I'm actually originally a classicist, and I'm partly looking at these poetries from a sort of comparative viewpoint, so the similarities with archaic Greek poetic forms. I feel like there's been a lot done on sort of formulaic composition and performance of epic, but not so much, we don't have so many parallels for the other poetic forms which are more improvised contests, which we see throughout the Greek and Roman world. I'm also looking at how these poetries directly use classical myth. So as a caveat, most of my samples you'll see will be examples where they actually draw on Greco-Roman antiquity, but this is not representative of the body of poetry. They have a vast subject matter. They talk about politics, contemporary events, moon landings, varieties of mythical traditions. So this is not representative, but this is because this is what I'm researching. But it has important implications for the use of literacy. I mean, as a classicist used to studying texts from 2,000-3,000 years ago, obviously the most exciting thing for me is that these are live poets. This is a live, living oral tradition, and I could go and do field work. So pre-pandemic, luckily, I went and spent several months traveling around rural Northeast Brazil, making recordings, interviewing poets, using archives. So one of the reasons I'm so excited to be presenting to this group is that I'm hoping that I'll hear from you if this has any overlaps with cultures that you're researching, if it might be useful to your research, and how you approach similarly hybrid oral and textual material like what I've got. So thinking about writing orality, I guess my first thing I'd like to say about these poems is that even in the earliest textual narrative poems that were brought to Brazil, orality is still the sort of key component. So this is an extract from a poem called Donzella Teodora, which is one of the earliest poems imported from Brazil, both as an oral ballad and as a poetic chapbook, because there were lots of chapbooks in early Portugal as well. which were some of the main texts imported to Brazil, actually in chapbook form. Like I said, it's a very early story. It's got roots in sort of Arabic influences as well in the Iberian Peninsula. So Donzella Teodora is a slave and she wants to marry a king. So to prove her worth, she undergoes a rigorous oral examination. And the centerpiece of this whole poem is this examination. And she's asked about a range of topics to demonstrate her erudition. And I say the main topic is probably astrology. So astrology was still is very much tied in with notions of erudition, and oral poets are typically extremely well versed in astrology and the zodiac. And we can see that this is present here in the very early roots of the tradition. So here's just a short extract where she's been questioned on the signs of the zodiac, and she's given quite detailed answers, and she goes through all of the signs of the zodiac. So the next extract is from a later poem. This is published as a chapbook in the middle of the 20th century. It's a sort of spin-off, a sequel. It's called The Daughter of Donzella Teodora. And Donzella Teodora has a daughter called Artemisa, who also undergoes an oral examination. And she is questioned by 5 sages, among whom are Socrates and Anacreon, which I find quite fun. And we can see here it's less about astrology and more about popular riddle traditions. So Socrates asks her things like, what exists and has no color, you can't grasp it or touch it. And she says, health and thought and imagination. And so we can see this is part of a popular riddling oral tradition. So both of these examples show how textual narratives represent oral practices. So the two are very much entwined, they're central to the narrative. Okay, so my next example, as I mentioned before, we have these two sort of parallel forms of popular poetry. We have the live improvised contest, and then we have the textual chapbook. Now there's an interesting crossover where often you have textual chapbooks that supposedly are transcriptions of some of these oral contests that actually occurred. And the way that we have these are passed down is that we have a type of person called an apologista, an apologist, who's a fan basically of oral poetry, and he goes along and he's got an amazing memory, and as the oral poet is extemporaneously improvising these verses, this other guy is memorizing them, and that's one of the ways that we receive so many of these verses today. So we've got, this is just the opening paragraph of one of these poems saying that this guy is going to narrate another duel that happened live orally in another time. So what we've kind of got that's interesting is we've got we start with an oral live moment, and then it passes to oral memory, and then it's going into text, and then it's going to be reperformed again. So we've got this really interesting backwards and forwards between the textual and the oral. So far in these examples, we've got this dialogic contest between two live oral poets and how you can translate that into a text. One of the most famous duels in the sort of canon, I guess, of popular poetry in Brazil is this one between Romano and Inácio. This happened at the end of the 19th century. And supposedly, the story goes, the two poets were competing, singing and exchanging verses all day and all night before one of them could finally get the upper hand. I think it's interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, because whilst this encounter between the poets probably did take place, there's no reason to suppose it didn't. This version we know cannot be 100% accurate because they're represented as using meters that actually only became popular in the 20th century. So we know that there's been some level of embellishment through the 20th century to this exchange. And I think it's a good example of how an oral moment becomes a sort of canonical, mythologized, foundational moment within the tradition. It's also very interesting because it shows the importance of textual sources and literacy to the oral exchange. So these two poets, although poetically they're very well matched, they have a very different social standing. So Romano's on the left and Inácio's on the right in this picture. Romano is a white man and he is able to read and write. And Inácio, so this duel took place before the abolition of slavery in Brazil. Inácio is a black enslaved man who cannot read and write. And the final verse that finally enables Romano, the white man, to win is this. So Romano suddenly comes out with this data stream of classical names. I mean, this is all in verse, in meter, improvised, so it is still quite impressive. And at the end, he says, Inácio, now untie this knot that I've given you, meaning either tell me in verse who all these people are, or come back with another verse of equally dense classical stuff to show me how erudite you are. And Inácio says, I can't. Since you've sung science, he calls this science, I can't respond, so you've won. And that's how this mythical contest finishes. So, I mean, classical myth was still very much related to textual knowledge. And so we can see here that it's the ability to read and write and to know this kind of information that finally enables winning this oral moment. Just another example of that. I'm sorry, the writing's a bit small, but it's on the handout if you want to look at it later. This is another contest between two oral poets, and they've decided to improvise on the topic of ancient Greece, and just to show the level of detail that they can improvise on. Again, this is the textual version, but there's no reason to think that it's been embellished, because I have seen live oral poets improvise with this level of detail and accuracy. So yeah, it probably is quite an accurate representation of what might have happened. And again, it shows the importance of the textual tradition to the oral moment. And many poets are really open about the fact that they go away and study, that they read books, that reading is important to them, basically because to be a good cantador, you need to be able to improvise on any topic. You need to know a little bit of everything, at least come up with one verse so that you're not defeated in the same way that Inácio was. However, there's also a real pride in rejecting the elite sort of textual culture of the region. So I quite like this verse, which says, I greatly admire the courtyard poet who spends 2 years making a sonnet. After 3 months, he finishes a quartet. With all this time, it still lacks elegance. With ink and paper, he traces a sketch, counting his fingers to work out the meter. Such nights of sleep he loses to study, to finally show so paltry a product. Indeed, of such verses, I make 2 or 3 in a minute, singing a gallop along the seaside. So you can see it's a sort of, he's definitely poking fun there at these textual poets who spend hours sweating over certain lines when he can just reel them off like this. And again, we've got another example of this rejection of the textual. So this poet improvises, I am a master of philosophy, a professor of mathematics. I am the author of computer sciences. I studied cosmology. I know geography. I'm the inventor of the vaccine. I discovered hemoglobin, the cosmic laws of space, greatly dexterous. Everything that I know, nobody taught me. So we do have this idea of study, but also he's situating himself in a system which is not part of sort of official education. Okay, so certainly many poets would build their erudition without access to texts. I mean, this has to be the case because many poets were illiterate. But there are various ways that they would acquire the kind of classical knowledge that we've seen here, for example. For a start, in interviews, some poets refer to this sort of system of hospitality between poets, where when they were younger, before they were maybe seen as a mature poet, they're not a threat yet, they would be sent to spend time in the territory of another poet as a sort of apprentice. So you'd go and spend time there, learn what there is to be learned there, learn what there is to learn with that new poet, and then come back. In this case, travel is incredibly important. So these are traveling poets. Every place they go, they're going to learn new information. They're going to see different poets performing, and they're going to try and memorize as much of that information as they can. And also almanacs and astrology, as I mentioned, are really essential parts of the culture, and they come with their own sort of baggage of information. And in my interviews, there emerged another slightly more surprising source of poetic information and inspiration, which is the dead. So this is a chapbook called Does Poetry Come from the Dead? Which kind of, yeah, so this region, Northeast Brazil, is home to multiple religious and spiritual traditions which assert the possibility of communication with the dead and of reincarnation. So one poet I interviewed was describing how he was in the middle of a very important verse contest and he just drew a blank. He couldn't think of a verse. And at that very important moment, his dead father, who was also a poet, appeared to him and gave him a verse, which he then sang, and he won the contest. Which to me is highly reminiscent of the classical muses, this idea that you receive poetry from somewhere beyond, some kind of supernatural force. Another cantador described the dialogic relationship between two improvising poets as a sort of telepathy. And he said that is an experience. He uses the same language as the religious traditions of the region to say that this is a direct example of divine supernatural connection. Another poet describes how, got a sample for this one, how supernatural, how canonical international figures that they might use elsewhere to demonstrate their erudition, like the classical figures I showed earlier, actually became reincarnated in Brazil. So this is a story about a man called Sodre, who now lives in a small village called Canindé in Brazil, and he's already been reincarnated 380 times. And he's talking about how in his little village is actually full of people like Moses and Ramses reincarnated. We've got another oral poet who I spoke to who describes the art of improvisation as a psychography. So he describes receiving these images from beyond and then translating them to the audience in words, which I find very interesting. We've got an oral poet describing his practice as a sort of spiritual writing. Now, psychography is a very important cultural tradition in the region. For example, we have Chico Xavier, who was a 20th century spiritual medium. He himself was illiterate, came from a very poor background, but under the guide of his spiritual guide, Emmanuel, who's pictured here, he wrote dozens of books in multiple languages. And he's a very important figure for Northeast Brazilians. There are also several of these chapbook poems which begin by saying this was psychographed. So the poet that wrote it was in possession of a spirit and wrote it. And I think, and we also have often this implication that writing itself has a sort of supernatural or religious power. So this is the prophecy of a mysterious letter. I mean, poets in the region often are attributed with sort of prophetic powers, and they often function almost like traveling preachers. But I think here we have the idea of writing having a sort of religious power, which I think is quite common in early text cultures generally. So I'd like to propose, I guess, that the transition between the two media, between spoken word and written word, is here imagined as quite literally a spiritual medium. So here are the examples of which I began my talk with this dialogic contest, this backwards and forwards, which has always been completely key to these poetries, here functions as a sort of permeable interface between human and the divine, and between the immortal and the immortal, and also enables the transition between the oral and the written. So again, we've got this movement between the medium of speech and writing negotiated as spiritual mediums. And this act of shifting between the two then becomes imbued with its own sort of supernatural power as a moment of poetic potential and inspiration. So I'm going to finish there because I want to hear more of the discussion and what you might have to say about that. But I hope that's been interesting to people. And thank you very, very much all for turning up and listening.
Thank you so much, Connie. Yes, if you can unshare. So I'm gonna repaste the rules very, very quickly in the chat for those who joined us after I said this already. Again, just to remain muted. If you have a question, just type question, and then if you have a follow-up, we will prioritize that. When you talk with the presenter, you're free to go back and forth, but try to keep it to a minimum so everybody can participate. If you really do not want to unmute yourself and communicate directly because there's noise in the background or whatever, type the question in the chat and we will read it for you. So just fire ahead. Okay, Harry.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. Two really fascinating talks. I enjoyed them both so much. My question's for Tyler. I was really interested in what you were saying about how the Japanese material that you've looked at suggests how has made you see the episodic nature of the Iliad. And it just made me think of I think it's in the Poetics when Aristotle says, when he praises the Iliad by saying, oh, all other epics are really episodic and they're not unified, whereas the Iliad is really good because it's unified. What do you make of that? Do you think that Aristotle is kind of not recognizing what the Iliad is really like, or do you think it's just that the Iliad has maybe been kind of edited in a way which makes it kind of cohere, or has it just been read more generously? Or I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I would say that the Iliad shows signs, for lack of a better term, of engineering in some spots. I think the best example is Book 1. Book 1 is very different from most of the others in that there are 3 or 4 distinct episodes that jump between one another quite frequently. So we start with the quarrel, then we're going to Chryses Island, then we're back to the quarrel. Then we have Achilles talking to Thetis, Thetis going to Olympus, and all there's little kind of vignettes here and there of those things interacting with each other throughout. That doesn't seem like something that would be produced by just oral episodes being clumped together. Maybe they originated that way, but it definitely seems engineered. And you have a few other examples with some of the battle books, for example. So yeah, I think one of our problems here is we can't really take any other epic beside the Odyssey as a comparison, which probably has similar engineering at work. But I would imagine, just based off of what I've seen with the Heike tradition, that the Iliad and the Odyssey probably are much more polished compared to other episodic poems. So I talked briefly in my talk about the Hogen Monogatari and the Heiji Monogatari in the Japanese tradition. Those are both very similar to the Heike, but they're much more crude. They don't seem to have been engineered, polished as much, mostly because they probably weren't as popular. The Heike was like the work of war poetry, for lack of a better term, in medieval Japan. So yeah, that's probably an indication of what's going on there, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great answer. Thank you.
Next one, we have Siobhan. Please tell me how to pronounce that.
Hello, it's Siobhan, despite appearances.
Siobhan, sorry.
I wanted, thank you both, that was fascinating. I wanted to ask Connie about this process of transcription that you mentioned, where your man will spontaneously remember the poem and write it down. And so I just wanted to know if that is true. Do they write down what the oral poet says? Is it accurate, or are they inventing their own poetry when they produce those written versions? And also, do they then have any status as original composers of the poetry?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of whether or not they're accurate, I mean, I guess we can't tell unless we were literally there. But I don't think that they're that inaccurate. So there's obviously, when they go and write it down, that's one thing. But when you talk to, there's a long tradition of memorizing particularly good verses. So when I talk to oral poets, and I would say, do you know anyone who maybe improvises about Greek and Roman myth? And they go, let me think, and then they just pull out of their memory, this person, and then they just repeat the verse that they particularly remembered. So they've got this sort of huge catalogue in their minds of verses that they liked. So I don't see why it wouldn't be accurate. Certainly when it then comes to being written down in the chapbooks, I think there's more opportunity for poetic license. Also, so some of the jewels that are represented certainly did happen, but there are some which didn't happen. So some are people imagining, imagine if this poet met this poet, imagine what it would look like. A bit like those fantasy, like imagine if King Kong met a Tyrannosaurus Rex and what would it look like? And so some of them are between poets, but some of them are like, they take it a bit further and they'd say, oh, let's imagine this poet who died 100 years ago meeting and having a poetic contest with the devil in hell. What would that look like? And then they improvise on that. So there's a bit of both, I think. And the second part of the question about whether they then get any credit, I think if you're writing it down, then you probably do put your name on the front of the chapbook. These apologistas who go around just remembering things, I don't think you really get any credit. It took me a long time to realize that they even existed. They seem to be a bit of a footnote, but as soon as you realize they exist, they're actually incredibly important for understanding how a lot of these poems are remembered. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Tasha, I see your question.
Yeah, hi, I have a quick question for both speakers about a similar topic. Thanks for your talk, so really interesting. I was just wondering more about the spiritual dimension to both of these pieces. So for Tyler, you mentioned that there was like a religious kind of spiritual supernatural aspect. So I was wondering if part of your research included like no plays, because I know there are some based on the Heike Monogatari, and obviously they feature a lot of chanting and things that could be considered religious. And for Connie, I was wondering just a bit more about the role of mediumship in these communities, whether it's something that's socially accepted as, yes, there are psychics, or whether it's related to spiritualism in the West, or how these ideas came about. So those were my questions.
Nice. Yes, I absolutely do talk about no plays. Pretty much there's 5 main kind of variants of no plays. The kind of warrior ghost plays are the ones that seem most heavily influenced by the Heike tradition. In fact, over half the characters featured in those plays are typically drawn from the Heike Monogatari itself. And they play out in a very similar way to the scenes in the Heike that are associated with expiatory ritual for Taira ghosts, basically. The idea was if you perform an episode in which a particular hero died, that's supposed to help like put his spirit at rest or something like that in the traditional mode of Heike performance. Those early no plays seem to maybe fulfill a similar function, or they're meant to basically mimic that. In a lot of cases, the angry ghosts in the plays will have conversations with Biwa Hoshi or with Buddhist priests who will, at the end of the play, will basically perform the same role and pray for their souls and give them peace and stuff like that. So they have a very similar function. I've actually done a little comparing between that no tradition and Greek tragedy as well, because there's a ton of interesting similarities there. I'm still working out what I want to do with that, though. It's easy with this type of thing to bite off a little too much. So currently sorting through the tragedy no thing and deciding where I want to go with that.
Yeah, thank you. I'd be interested in reading it once you've finished it.
Absolutely. I'd love to share.
Okay, yeah, so about, I guess the first part of the question was about how acceptable Spiritism is in society. That's kind of, there's no straightforward answer. It's definitely, these beliefs are definitely an important part of the sort of cultural matrix of the region. So everyone will be aware of them and how they work. But certainly not everyone will believe in them. And as I said, it's a really vast area, and the poetic traditions, I mean, they may seem a bit niche, but I mean, it's a huge tradition and it's hugely varied. So there'll be some poets who very much say, yes, my dead dad gave me a verse, and there'll be others that say, no, of course not, that's stupid superstition. So you can't, but historical links are definitely there as well. And whether or not it's acceptable also depends on what kind of spiritism you're talking about. So if you are talking about candomblé, which is a sort of African Catholic religion, which has possession by spirits, then you're probably not going to shout that from the rooftops, because there's still a huge amount of racism, and certain cultures are valued very differently. And actually in popular poetry, there's a huge amount of racism. It really comes out. Whereas white spiritism comes from Allan Kardec, which is sort of European spiritism. Allan Kardec was French. And so when you have the sort of spiritism of Victorians in the UK who actually sort of claim to speak to Homer or whatever, it's a similar tradition that's been developed in Brazil. But it's still very much practiced in Brazil. And of Brazilians, I think the general approach in Brazil is that whilst Europeans are still using Ouija boards, my God, that's so outdated. It's much more sophisticated now. It's a very sophisticated philosophy, I guess, and way of life, which combines sort of Buddhism and Christianity. It's very serious, and I think it should be taken very seriously as a sort of literary theory as well. So I think a lot of the stigma that maybe would be attached to it here is because of these very old-fashioned ideas of what spiritism would look like, that we wouldn't be so derisive about Buddhism, for example. But yeah, I think in Brazil now it's very much a fusion, and it's very sophisticated. So yeah, depends who's using it and what for and who you talk to, but it's complicated.
Yeah, thanks for that comprehensive answer. I get a better idea now of what the situation is like.
Thank you. Bernardo?
Yep, I'm here. Thanks a lot, both. They were both amazingly rich talks, and both related to Homer, so I could not be happier. So I've got a question for each of you. I'll start with Tyler. Well, first a note about Homer. I do like your idea a lot, and I think it is absolutely plausible in a sense. But the one problem I have is that in Homer's tradition, I can't see that extent of variation which you describe for the Heike tradition instead. So how would you respond to that? And then second half of the question, could you say a bit more about the level of literacy that you envisage for the Japanese oral bards, especially since you said that there was a lot going on in the temple environments when it came to the Kataribon versions, and also in that very interesting colophon that you quoted, which I'm not sure if it is a Yomihon or a Kataribon version, but it clearly seemed that the author, the old man, was working in a very much literate environment. So is that so? And how about those singers in the periphery that you you talked about those who accompanied armies, were they literate as well? What do we know about them? Thank you.
Great questions. To the first one, I would respond basically, I think here we see a key difference between the Heike and the Iliad itself. As I mentioned kind of in a roundabout way, the Heike is significantly longer and more complicated than the Iliad itself. So if I were to actually compare the two, I say it's more apt to really compare the Trojan cycle itself with the Heike Monogatari. They perform similar functions. The Heike is the story of the entire Genpei War, and the Iliad, of course, is but like a very short period of time, kind of a snapshot. And we know from antiquity that there were several other tales that told the whole story of the war. So I think to get a better picture for that, you would have to take all of the different episodes of the Trojan cycle and put them together into one super epic. And that would basically be your Greek equivalent of the Heike. And so I think that that kind of accounts for the less variation with Homer, because Homer was telling a specific story. In the same way that you can look at certain long episodes in the Heike and find, or entire roles in the Heike and find much less variation from a certain point onward, I think you'll find a similar thing with the Homeric Iliad. So that's how I would respond to that. I think that's a key problem for sure to deal with, because the variation that you see in surviving Homeric manuscripts is relatively minor compared to what we're talking about with the Heike tradition, where you have just vastly different texts in the earlier versions. As for the second question, the fascinating thing about literacy among Japanese singers is that the blind performers guilds were the ones responsible for keeping this written performance tradition alive. They're all blind. What are they doing writing things down? And that's what's so cool about the colophon, is you have a blind singer dictating to a member of the guild who apparently can read and write. So he's clearly not that blind. And that actually gets into some of the nuance of the blind guilds, because what we can tell based on what we know of the early modern period, so like the 19th century, early 20th century, pretty much anyone who was even remotely visually impaired was eligible for membership in the performers guilds. So a singer in the 60s and 70s who was followed around by an ethnomusicologist, he was actually sighted from birth and then developed basically an eye condition where his eyesight deteriorated as he got older. He was literate, he could read and write. Eventually, obviously, that was no longer the case, but I think we probably have a similar thing happening in the medieval period there. Obviously, you will have purely blind bards who will continue and obviously have to rely on the oral tradition in order to work with this stuff. But yeah, that's what's so interesting about it is, and that's probably one of the reasons why the oral tradition survives as long as it does in the Japanese tradition, because blind singers can't read, and so they have to keep going with orality. Whereas if everyone was sighted, it probably would have become fixed and written at a much, much earlier date. And so I'd love to take that to the next level with the Greek tradition and go full speculative theory mode with blind bards and that sort of thing. There's the germ of an idea there, but we just have so little information about really disabled people generally in antiquity, but specifically the blind, what singers were like, and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, we're very limited by evidence there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And very briefly for Connie, thank you too. I guess I have the reverse question to Shoban. You said that there is a back and forth between writing and orality. So how if you could tell a bit more about how these written versions then influence the oral performance, and again about the level of literacy and is it uniform, or do we have a lot of variation? And I found fascinating that they have this original myth of one elite bard and a less elite bard. How does this play out in practice? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Before I answer, I should just mention to Tyler that there are several blind bards in northeast Brazil as well, very famous ones. So it's obviously a thing. It's obviously a thing having a famous blind bard, but they're not all blind. So don't know how that helps you. So yeah, levels of literacy really vary. Traditionally, you know, when you read a lot of texts about these poets, they'll say, oh, they were all illiterate. But as you dig deeper, that's just clearly not the case. And that maybe in itself is part of this founding myth of orality, that of course, none of them are literate, so it's completely oral. But that's not the case. They, in interviews, both my interviews and other interviews, they repeatedly talk about how important reading is to them in order to hone their craft. Yes, in terms of that that very old example of very elite and very not elite poets, that did definitely happen, because even within, these are all popular poets, so we're still talking about a relatively disenfranchised, very economically poor class of people. And I mean, wealth disparity in northeast Brazil is very extreme. But even amongst the poorest classes, you could still be a slave or a free man. So yes, we're still talking about oral poetry. Yes, popular poetry, yes, that there's still limited access to education, but the differences in social status, even within that class, can be very extreme. And when we read the earlier accounts of these contests, the levels of racism is quite upsetting. And we're quoted saying that no matter how good a Black poet was in the sort of early 20th century, even you know, a free man, no matter how good he was, he could never beat a white poet. It just wasn't socially allowed. Obviously, that's not the case now, but it is there in the history of the poetry.
It's not obvious.
It's there in the history of the poet. Yeah, okay, maybe it's not obvious, but I mean, it's not a written law. You know,
Okay.
not, I get the impression that before he would have like been beaten up, and you know.
Yeah.
In terms of how the written versions of the oral moments then go back and influence the oral moments, I guess there are several ways. I mean, it feeds back into the tradition more generally. So these are then going to be performed. And again, how might, for example, an illiterate oral poet learn? Well, it's by listening to previous poets' compositions, who might then sing about some very erudite subject matter. So even if you've got a few poets who are very literate and who are studying books, just the fact that they're then inserting, you know, putting in data back into the oral system means that poets who can't read or write are then learning that same material by listening to them and by hearing them performed. I think that answers all the elements of the question.
Yeah, it does. But if I could just follow up a bit, you know, with us, I've for instance, I'm on the lookout for orality in ancient Babylonian stuff, and so it is very difficult, of course, to know how you know, to distinguish what is more or less oral, of course. So you are an expert on this poetry. Let's say they give you a version which is some kind of polished transcription, and a version from one of these books. Would you be able to distinguish one from the other, or not?
I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because
It's difficult. Okay, good.
Even within one of the this is sort of related, doesn't directly answer your question, but it's sort of related. One of the complaints about modern recording technologies among oral poets is that it records the whole thing, not just the best verses, which is unfair, because in the past, when someone would just be orally remembering, they would just pick the best verses to remember, and that would be a good representation of the poet. You don't have, because no poet is perfect. I think that's the point. It's not like a text where you only produce a perfectly edited version. Obviously, even the best poet is going to have verses where they're just not as good, they're just not as inspired. So it's seen as particularly unfair that when you come along with a recording mic, you get the whole thing, not just their highlights. And that's seen as really changing the conditions of how poet is remembered. Which is related to a question, because the transcriptions that we have of what probably were genuine oral moments probably pick up the best verses, the ones that have the least of those sort of oral glitches, or there aren't any ums and ahs because it's got to be in meter. But they're always the best verses that maybe look like it's tempting to think they've been tinkered with in the written form, but they probably haven't. They were just when the poet was particularly inspired. So yeah, really difficult to tell, because obviously if you get a verse that looks like the poet's really not doing that great, you can say, that's probably a very accurate transcription of the oral moment, but they're not the ones that traditionally have been recorded.
Thank you very much.
We have a follow-up on this topic by a person. We're going to stay a few minutes more.
Yeah, I just, in some ways, Connie has already started answering this, but in the Perry Lord material, it's clear that sometimes the literate Yugoslav changed the words of an epic when he was transcribing the recordings to make it a better literary version. So I'm curious if there's anything like that in your material.
I mean, I'm sure there must be. I guess the most obvious one is that early exchange I showed you between the free man and slave, where I said that's become a sort of foundational myth, and we know that it's been edited because it shifts into a different meter. It mysteriously shifts into sort of 20th century meter in parts. I mean, there are over 40 different types of meter that a cantador has to be well versed in and ready to improvise in, because his opponent can just decide, let's test your agility, let's switch meter, see if you can keep up. And certain meters come in and out of fashion, and the meter does change and go into a more fashionable 20th century meter. So maybe that's an example of the poet that's writing it down, wanting to make it more on trend. So maybe that's an example of that.
There's one last question and we can close with that. I'm going to read it from Kiat. This is for both speakers. Are there examples of storytelling paintings accompanying during the performance? So using painting while they're performing.
At the same time?
Yes, that is my understanding of the question. Using visual images while they're performing.
So literally at the same time, not so much, but this sort of woodcut print art that you see in the front of the chapbooks is really important, because when you're selling them, a lot of the people buying it can't necessarily read the title or flick through it. So, how are you going to know that this is an adventure story about a woman doing knife fights if you didn't have a nice simplistic eye-catching illustration of a woman fighting with knives? So that is very important, and that's the kind of that's became a whole art genre in itself, the woodcut print. And I've actually got some around in my house somewhere, but I won't show them now. But you get these huge, big, beautiful prints. There's a guy called Jota Borges, if you want to look them up. I'll write it in the chat. He does amazing mythological ones where he represents, if you look up Jota Borges Xilogravura, then you'll get some really beautiful images, which sort of recount daily themes, daily scenes in the marketplace, poets, but also the myths. So yes, they are an important part of it. It's very linked.
In the Greek and the Japanese traditions, there is not artwork that accompanies the performances themselves, but both traditions spawn very vibrant and important artistic genres, basically. One of the ways that we actually track the spread of the Homeric poems over time is the appearance of certain Homeric scenes on vase paintings. So for example, the full Iliad, from what we can tell, is relatively late in coming to Attica, the region of Athens, because for a long time, only the last quarter of the Iliad seems to be depicted on vases. And then suddenly we start seeing all of the other stuff in this latter part of the 6th century BC. So no, there's nothing during performance. In the Japanese tradition later, a lot of the Rufabone in particular will have woodcuts or woodblock prints and stuff like that that are included. So lots of very famous distinctive scenes and stuff like that are painted in that style. But no, in the earlier times, especially when the oral tradition is still alive and going, to my knowledge, there's no visual artwork that accompanies performances.
Thank you everybody for the questions. We're a bit over time, but it's just so beautiful to see the discussion going on and on and on. I'm sure the speakers are happy to answer more questions via email if you want to. Please join us next week for another 2 amazing talks on reviving performance. And just a reminder, we're going to start at a different time, but you will get an email for that. So thank you again to the speakers, to the audience, to you all for zooming in, and just stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.